We've labeled this entire unit Modernism, a term that probably seems a little strange to you since modernist art is mostly associated with the first half of the 20th century. I'm not going to linger on this slide, which is reproduced in your workbooks, but you do need to know that the early 20th century was a time of great political, intellectual, and artistic upheaval. World War I revealed the savage underbelly of technology and dashed hopes, frankly, that the human race was progressing steadily toward greater peace and prosperity. Nietzsche proclaimed that God was dead. Marx proclaimed that capitalism was ripe for destruction. Freud proclaimed that our dreams revealed our inner selves, and they were all about sex. In the world of art, we will continue to encounter a bewildering list of isms, many of which are listed on this slide. For now, just understand that during this period, art generally moves away from illusionism to abstraction, as artists seek to use color, line, shape, and composition to convey a deeper reality. You'll notice that once again I'm including borrowed summary slides. In all of the ism and art schools that I'll throw at you today, what we'll see, starting with the scream, which I talked about in my last lecture, and continuing with the paintings I'm about to show you, you're going to see different branches of what is called Expressionism. Impressionists, again, tried to capture a fleeting visual reality. Expressionists, really starting with some of the post-impressionists and even Munch, tried to capture emotional reality. The primary tools they used were brilliant, even jarring colors, thick textured paint or impasto, and strong lines, including black outlines. Fauvism was a brief but influential movement of French artists who rejected what they saw as fin de siècle despair and symbolist literary pretensions. They tried to return to Impressionism's joyful embrace of nature, while retaining Post-Impressionism's expressive use of color and its acknowledgement of the act of painting on a two-dimensional surface. In 20th century art isn't always cheerful. The Fauvists, who notably painted before World War I fractured the West, convey an exuberant happiness that I frankly really love. Here's a painting entitled The Joy of Life by founder and leader of the Fauves, Henri Matisse. The painting is filled with references to past masterpieces. Can you identify any of these? Well, we see shout-outs to pastoral scenes of Venetians like Titian, Ingres' sensuous long-back nudes, Monet's luncheon on the grass, maybe even cave paintings. Like Cézanne, Matisse employs shifting perspectives. He uses landscape more as a stage than as a realistic setting, with trees featuring essentially as curtains. The painting is imbued with sensuality, heightened by the bold, pure, that is highly saturated colors. The painting also redirected the course of art history, because this painting made Picasso very jealous. It was after he saw The Joy of Life that Picasso began working on his Demoiselles d'Avignon, which were basically kind of an exercise in one-upmanship. From there, well, it all gets a little crazier and frankly a lot less cheerful. So here's another non-required Matisse painting, although I could really imagine the ECB asking you to identify this as expressionist or even as fauve. Again, we see color liberated from descriptive reality. Not even Parisian women sported green noses. Again, like Cézanne, Matisse uses color patches, advancing warm colors and receding cool colors to create a perception of death while still embracing the essentially two-dimensional quality of painting. Here are two more characteristic Matisse paintings. Notice the expressive use of bold color and what his critics call an unfinished look to the canvas. Line has likewise returned, as it did with the post-impressionists. Here we see it in the form of boldly outlined figures. And now, our required Matisse work. Once again, we see the expressive use of color, although in this case it's actually somewhat more realistic. We also see the introduction of multiple perspectives. For example, as we look at this painting, we see the goldfish both from the side and from above, shades of Cézanne. You learned from your reading why Matisse was so fascinated with goldfish. I could really imagine this painting showing up in an attribution question. And again, Matisse was fascinated with patterns, especially textile patterns. You saw this in our required work, and here are a couple more examples. The odalisque on the left was also painted after Matisse traveled to North Africa. That's when he became interested in goldfish, right? Durand was a co-founding Fauve artist and a Mrs. McConnell favorite who did not make the cut. But you might be asked to attribute a painting to the Fauves based on its highly saturated, expressive colors and, frankly, its rather joyful spirit. Durand was also important to art history because he introduced his collection of fang masks to Matisse, Durand, and even more significantly, to Picasso. The Dance by Durand reveals the influence of his African art collection. Again, the wildly vibrant colors are typical of the Fauves. Another prominent Fauve painter who doesn't show up in the required works is Georges Rouault. I included him because he was a devout Catholic and painted many religious scenes. Well, do you get the feeling that the Fauvist branch of Expressionism is one of my favorites? Here is the 21st century Expressionist painting that hangs over my fireplace in Palo Alto. It's a landscape that captures the scenery around our southern Utah home near Capitol Reef, and the painter is a friend and neighbor. Yes, she does paint a great deal better than I can take photos on my phone. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed that brief glimpse of the cheerful wild beast, because we are now moving east and the outlook, political, philosophical, and artistic, becomes grimmer. By the beginning of the 20th century, the old authorities, the monarchy, the church, were under challenge from science and from democracy. In Germany, however, an autocratic regime held on to power. Late and rapid industrialization created great social dislocation and hardship. And finally, a string of German philosophers pronounced the end of religion, the end of history, and the end, they hoped, of the established order. German artists were heavily influenced by Nietzsche, who called for a deconstruction of morals, that is, for moving beyond outdated, he thought, concepts of good and evil, to an embrace of a will to power. We've recently seen how that works out. Here's some of the passage from Nietzsche's Thus Spake Zarathustra that gave Die Brücke its name. Here's the quote. Man is a rope stretched between the animal and the superman, a rope over an abyss, a dangerous crossing, a dangerous wayfaring, a dangerous looking back, a dangerous trembling and halting. Not especially cheerful. And here is a famous painting by a required artist, though it's not our required work. Note the jarring, dissonant colors. Reminds me a little of the Mannerist artists, who also sought to unsettle their viewers with strange combinations of tertiary colors. You can also see that Kirchner was influenced by Munch. He's interested in psychological angst, in the individual's alienation from society, and the dangerous, unsettling power of women. The German Expressionists were more likely than the Fauves to paint urban scenes, and the frenetic yet somehow still isolated life of city dwellers is a constant theme in their work. They deeply admired Van Gogh and often imitated his swirling brushstrokes. They also employed angular lines, again reflecting the sharpness and danger, as they saw it, of urban life. Here are a few other paintings by Kirchner that capture some of these same elements. The jarring color, the aggressive objectification of women, to use the feminine term, and a somewhat less than cheerful outlook on life. Kirchner actually painted our required work after Die Brücke dissolved. But again, those jarring colors, fierce lines, and gloomy content are typical elements of this group. And this is also a painting with a backstory. Kirchner volunteered as a driver in the German Army artillery in the hopes of avoiding the trenches. He had many health issues and was soon declared unfit to serve, much to his relief. Nevertheless, the war would leave a permanent mark on his art and on his life. He did not lose an arm in the war. The amputation shown here is a metaphor for the scars his brief military service left on his psyche, and even more dramatically on young men all over Europe. I will talk more about World War I's impact on art in a later lecture. Der Blaue Reiter was formed in 1911 in Munich as a loose association of painters led by Russian immigrant Vasily Kandinsky and German native Franz Marc. They shared an interest in abstract forms and bright, highly saturated, prismatic colors, that is, the colors that appear in the rainbow. Similar, by the way, to the colors most commonly used by the Fauves. Members of the Blue Reiter, however, were more philosophical and more focused on expressing spiritual values that they hoped might counteract the corruption and materialism, as they saw it, of their age. Kandinsky wrote 20 years later that the name Blue Reiter emerged from Franz Marc's enthusiasm for horses and his own love of riders, combined with a shared love of the color blue. For Kandinsky, blue is the color of spirituality. The darker the blue, the more it awakens human desire for the eternal. The horse was also a prominent subject in Marc's work, which centered on animals as symbols of rebirth. Kandinsky is especially important to art history because he's really the first modern artist to move entirely into the world of the abstract. Kandinsky was especially influenced by what he saw as the perfect abstract art, which was music. Kandinsky sought to create image-free art that spoke directly to the senses, the way music did. In fact, most of his works bear titles associated with musical notation, such as composition or improvisation. He also claimed to experience synesthesia, or the ability to hear colors, see music, in other words, to cut across the boundaries between the senses. While Kandinsky's paintings lack clear representational figures, they all seem to capture a kind of cosmic conflict. Kandinsky was fascinated, for example, by the story of the flood in Genesis and by the apocalypse described in the book of Revelation. He also formed a close friendship with Arnold Schoenberg, a musician who was trying to work outside the traditional musical scale. Schoenberg developed his own 12-tone scale and composed all his work using that scale. I found a YouTube video that juxtaposes Kandinsky's paintings with Schoenberg's music. Here's a brief clip. Kandinsky's paintings are very distinctive, which you now see makes them tempting choices for attribution questions. Franz Marc was the other leading member of the Blue Reiter school, and in fact is most famous for his paintings of blue horses. He's another painter who's dropped off the list, but I'm showing you some of his anyway because, you guessed it, I really love his art. The pure colors notwithstanding, this is a violent painting. In 1913, war was threatening and would break out in just a year. These animals seemed to be trapped in the face of the coming catastrophe, soon to be shattered by man's inhumanity, and indeed, Marc himself would die in World War I, ending his brilliant career much too soon. Here are some of Marc's beautiful blue horses. When I was a child, my family had a large print of this work hanging in our family room. I loved the brilliant colors and evocative animals, and I wanted to walk into this painting. I still do. And here are some more Marc animal pictures. I haven't talked about Cubism yet. We're about to get there. But the way that Marc breaks animals into different surface planes shows the strong influence of Picasso and Braque, our next two artists. The brilliant colors, however, are pure Blue Reiter. And with that, we'll move on to Cubism and perhaps the greatest giant of the 20th century, Pablo